Shabbat shalom, everyone. So this week in the parashah, we read the second parashah that comes out of the book of Davarim. And as we read through this book, one of the things I'd like to, over the next month, 2 months or so, one thing I'd like to highlight about the book of Deuteronomy is its structure, and it's something to think about. What scholars have noted about this book is that the way it's laid out, in that it's establishing a covenant between God and the people of it and the children of Israel, but it's laid out in a very specific manner. And what we find is that it's laid out in the exact same way that when we look back in history at this time of Moses, so this is late Bronze Age, 1400s BC or so, that a common covenant that was made in the Near East countries at that time is what's known as a suzerain treaty or a suzerain covenant. And the key aspect of this type of covenant is that the two parties that are coming together in agreement, one is a superior authority to the other, and it's fully recognized by both sides that one of the people, this is not a covenant of two equals coming together, but it's one of a superior person making a treaty or making a covenant with a lesser people. So what we typically would see in history in this time is that if you were a king of a nation or an empire, and you conquered another people, after you conquered them, what you would do is then you would set up a treaty or a covenant with that people, and you would set out the agreements of this is what I, now as your new king, promise to you, and as my new subjects, this is what I expect you to promise to me. And so these covenants would basically have 5 components to them. And the really interesting thing is that when we read the book of Deuteronomy, we see that exact layout. In that the first thing that we see is that usually it starts off with a historical telling of the relationship between the two parties in the covenant that are entering into the covenant. And that's exactly what we get in Deuteronomy. That's what we read this week, and it's what we read was part of the parashah for this. We read it last week, and it's part of the parashah for this week. What have we been reading? We get this recounting by God through Moses, essentially, of the books of Exodus and Numbers. And it's a retelling of that relationship since God pulled the Israelites out of Egypt. And so we get like this summary account. And so exactly that's the whole purpose. God is restating to them, this is the relationship between me and you. From there, these covenants would then go into the stipulations. What is it that each side is agreeing to? And this occupies much of the book of Deuteronomy. And we kind of start that this week. Once we get into chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, we start to see these are the stipulations. What I mean by stipulations is that the weaker entity coming into the agreement is agreeing that we will obey these commandments. We will do these things. We will follow out these instructions. In essence, this is how we will show our obedience to you as the king. And then the stronger party in the covenant, this being God here, makes the promises for the people as well. That I promise to essentially protect you and to provide for you. And that's commonly what we would see in these covenants. The third provision of these covenants would then be that how would the covenant, when it was finalized, be displayed and remembered? And usually there was commandments and part of this covenant that would be agreed upon that the covenant would be read for all the people to hear. And we get that exactly in Deuteronomy. At every 7 years at Sukkot, the book of Deuteronomy is to be read. We also know about the testimony at Gerizim and Ebal, that once you enter into the land, you're supposed to do it. These are the ways that this covenant is supposed to be proclaimed, not just once, but on a routine basis, so that both parties are reminded of what they agreed to it. The next thing then is a listing of the consequences that will occur should one break the covenant. And again, that's what we get near the end of the book of Deuteronomy. We get God laying out If you follow the commandments that I've given you, these are the blessings that will be provided for you. But if you don't follow the commandments that have been given to you, these are the curses that will be given to you. So we see that laid out. And then usually these covenants would be finalized by a listing of the witnesses of the covenant. And we even get that in Deuteronomy, because we see at the very end where who can really be a witness to what God promises, because there's no one equal or greater than him to be a witness. So the best that can be done is he calls upon heaven and earth to be the witness to the covenant. And so exactly in these terms that was very familiar to the people in the ancient Near East, in that this is just how kings, once they conquered a people or took over a people's territory, how they would treat them. This is exactly what God is doing through the book of Deuteronomy. Now, as we look at, again, the parashah, especially the end of it this week, and over what we're going to be reading over the next month or so, probably a little longer than that, it's going to be, like I said, it's going to be that second item in the covenant. It's the part of the covenant that deals with the stipulations. What are we actually agreeing to in this covenant? And again, because the people entering into the covenant, or the entities entering into the covenant, are not equal. One is considered as superior and higher than the other, a greater authority than the other. It is, again, what are the commandments? What are the instructions? What are the statutes that are being placed on the people that they're expected to carry out? And so that's what we get here in Deuteronomy. And it's this part of the covenant, God reestablishing or renewing the covenant, first made at Sinai, here in the book of Deuteronomy. This seems to be the part of the covenant that throws many Christians off. And we all know this. Christians in general don't adhere to the idea that we have these stipulations, we have these rules, we have these expectations that are placed upon us by God. Instead, they want to think that because I'm saved, I now have freedom and liberty to essentially do whatever I want. And I think that's particularly true in the modern West and in the United States. If you go to Christians in Africa, in the Middle East today, in even somewhat to Latin America, but they've kind of been westernized as well, but anywhere in East Asia, anywhere where Christianity has spread that isn't as dominant by Western thoughts and ideas, those Christians don't have as much problem with this part. The idea that there would be instructions, that there would be expectations placed on you, they readily adhere to that. And even if you look at, we can look at Protestantism, and we're often critical of it in the sense of, this idea, once I'm saved, sin doesn't matter. Sin no longer is a worry for me. I can go about doing whatever I want. That wasn't even how Protestantism began. If you actually go back to the writers like Luther and Calvin and all of them, there's things we would disagree with because they all argued that the ceremonial parts of the law were done away with, but they all held that the moral aspects of the law still remained and that Christians were expected. And in their writings, you'll even see where they talk about that the Torah still has a relevance in the Christian life as kind of like a curb or a guardrail, still kind of, at least in terms of the moral implications, supposed to be guiding our behavior. But a lot of that's really been lost in the West over the last several generations. And the sad part of that, losing that, is it's because they don't understand the law. That's what's truly been lost, an understanding of what was the purpose of Torah. What is the purpose of those instructions? And because they've lost an understanding of that purpose, the law becomes burdensome to them. And we talked about this at Yeshiva, actually, as we're going through the book of Isaiah. I don't have this verse up here, but in Isaiah 28:13, God, speaking through Isaiah, tells the Jews of that, the Judites of that time, and the time of Hezekiah, that the word of the Lord has become a burden to you, again, because you lack the understanding of it. And therefore, 28:13a says, and the word of the Lord will be to them precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. And I talked about it at Yeshiva. I said, It's the idea that you don't understand what the purpose of the law is and how it guides and establishes the relationship between you and God, that it just becomes a burden. It's just one rule after another, line upon line, precept upon precept. And just think about it, you're carrying this law on your shoulders, and it's just brick upon brick upon brick upon brick, weighing you down heavier and heavier and heavier. But what Isaiah is showing, and what he's saying there, what God is saying through Isaiah, is it only feels that way if you don't understand it. If you don't understand the law. And Isaiah was saying it about his own prophecies. You feel that my prophecies of judgment that I bring to you, that God has put in my spirit to speak to you, you feel it's a weight placed upon you because you don't understand what God is in these gloomy judgments of destruction and punishment. You don't understand that what God's really doing is trying to call you back to him. So why do we struggle so much, especially in the United States, but really in the West, with this idea that we have to follow laws, that there are instructions and expectations placed upon us? Well, especially in the United States, obviously one of the things that in our culture that we kind of buck against is the idea that, well, as an American, I have rights, I have freedoms, I have the liberty to do what I want to do. I mean, it's a core value of American society. In many ways, that's a good value to have. But the problem becomes when we take those freedoms to mean not only are we free to express ourselves, to worship as we want, free to choose our elected leaders and so on, those good things about it, but we think we become free of responsibilities to others. And that's really what is one of the root problems in this country. Now, when people think about freedom, they often will think in the terms of, well, I should be free to do whatever I want as long as I don't harm anyone. That's usually the general principle that's out there. Former Supreme Court Justice from over 100 years ago, Oliver Wendell Holmes, he kind of said it nicely in that, the freedom to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. And that I can swing my fist all day, and I have the right to, but as soon as I hit your nose, then my freedom needs to be restricted there. I can't do harm to you. Now, of course, if that's your principle that you live by, then you get into debates, well, what actually causes harm? And so there's still lots of rooms to argue things, even if everyone agreed that should be the guiding principle. You can clearly say that, if you murder someone, or even if you just physically attack someone, or if you do damage to their property, or whatever it might be, most people can agree that's causing harm. But there's a lot of areas where people will debate. Well, take something like we have laws that say if you're in the front seat of a car, you have to be wearing a seatbelt, especially if you're driving it. Well, shouldn't I have the freedom to not wear a seatbelt if I choose to do so? And like if I choose to not wear a seatbelt, what harm is that to anybody else? Maybe I'm putting myself at more risk, and so there could be an argument that. To counter that, there's actually been studies done that shows when someone not wearing a seatbelt is in an accident versus someone who is wearing a seatbelt, there's actually the one not wearing a seatbelt actually typically does cause more harm to the other people involved in the accident. So again, we can argue these things. Up at Case, we see this all the time where students who get caught cheating. Whether it's looking off the answers of somebody else or trying to plagiarize something or whatever it might be, they'll ask well, what harm am I really doing? I'm benefiting from it, but I've not actually caused a detriment to anyone else. And then we get into discussions about how and try to make them realize that actually you may think it's harmless, but we can point out reasons and why it actually is creating harm. But again, that's the principle that most people in the United States and in the West like to operate on. But as a disciple of Yeshua, before we even get into that question of, well, what constitutes harm, so we can try to avoid that, we have to ask ourselves, is our freedom actually limited only by this principle? Don't cause harm to somebody else. Is this what the instructions of Torah suggests? Is this what Yeshua, his apostles, what the prophets of old taught? Or does Scripture establish a different principle in understanding our freedoms? And I would argue, and I'm going to show you this morning, that simply not causing harm is not the principle that Mashiach and the Scriptures laid down, because we're actually called to a much higher standard than that. And in order to show this standard, what we're going to do is walk through 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10, because Paul is addressing this idea of freedom right here. And, and bringing Paul into, Michael, I think he said it great last week, where, some Christians want to argue, well, Paul teaches that, basically we are free under the law and that the law doesn't pertain to us. And even in his own day, Paul was misunderstood as saying that. But then when you bring okay, well, if Paul's saying that, well, how do you reconcile that with the red letters? How do you reconcile this with what Yeshua says? And, so they've created this theology that, that Yeshua was speaking before the cross, and only in that context. Paul is speaking after the cross, and that, they try to create these artificial divisions. But Michael said it perfect. Actually, if your understanding of Paul seems to be in disagreement with Yeshua, the problem is your understanding of Paul. You're not understanding Paul correctly, because Paul is not at any point in disagreement with anything that Yeshua taught. Now, before we begin to read through these chapters, I do want to point out, to give you the context of them here in 1 Corinthians, what is the topic Paul's addressing in this section of his letter? And that topic is food being offered up to idols. And so that's the teaching in itself, but that could be a whole separate teaching in itself. I could just do that. But I want to really focus more upon what is Paul saying in using this one question of, can you eat food offered up to idols? What is he actually saying about exercising your freedoms as a disciple of the Mashiach, of Yeshua? So let's begin with 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 6, which says,
With regard to food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If someone thinks he knows something, he does not yet know to the degree that he needs to know. But if someone loves God, he is known by God. With regard then to eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol in this world is nothing, and that there is no God but one. If after all there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we live, and one Lord, Yeshua the Messiah, through whom are all things and through whom we live.
When we read the letter of 1 Corinthians, one thing we should always keep in the back of our mind is that Paul, in writing this letter, is actually responding to a letter that was sent to him. The community at Corinth had actually sent him a letter first, and he's responding to this. And so what we see as we go through this letter, he's addressing various topics that it's assumed were raised in the first letter. The letter he received, they were asking him all these questions. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that letter, so the only way we can guess is what was in that letter is what is Paul responding to. And we can see this, as an example, in 1 Corinthians 7:1a, Paul says, "Now in regards to the matters about which you wrote," that's why we know he's responding to a letter that he received. And as he's writing through this, as we get to chapter 8, the previous chapter, he had just addressed questions that were raised about marriage and sexual immorality. And now he's turning to this question of eating food sacrificed to idols. And based on what we read here in this passage, it seems likely that the letter sent to Paul might have actually tried to provide an argument as to why at least some people thought it was okay to eat food sacrificed to idols. And what would that be? Well, it's that idols aren't real. I mean, yeah, they're real and they're a physical object, but there's no real God behind them. And that they're merely man-made objects. And this is likely why Paul says, we all have knowledge. This is knowledge to have to come to realize that, an idol is just a material object, that we place importance into it. It actually has no importance, especially anything spiritual related to this. So he says this to indicate, I get your argument. I get this argument that there's really nothing to the idol there. They're just Again, man-made objects, a piece of wood, a metal, stone, shaped in a way, and we've attached spiritual significance that really doesn't exist to it. But then Paul asserts right from the beginning that there's a greater principle in play than simply having, in play here in answering this question, than simply having knowledge. And that is there's a principle of love. Love in the sense of charity or agape love, that self-sacrificing love that we are to display to others. And that's why he says, knowledge is going to puff you up. It's like an air filling up a balloon. It's just going to inflate you. Whereas love, it doesn't inflate where at some point maybe overinflate and ends up popping, or it could deflate at some point if you let the pressure out. But in contrast that he says love builds up. It edifies. It's like, a concrete a foundation being laid, and you build upon that. And so comparing knowledge to love, Paul asserts that those who think they are knowledgeable or know what is best, but in reality, they don't know what they should. He's like, yeah, you've got factual knowledge, but you don't have true knowledge. You don't have the wisdom to actually apply it correctly. And this is clear even in the sense, now Paul doesn't go down this route, but we could easily say that, and I've said it many times, knowledge alone is not going to bring you to know God or to be known by God. You can have knowledge of God, but you may not know, but you don't have true knowledge like that intimate relational knowledge of God. And just because you know God doesn't mean that you're known by God. Again, as James says, the demons know God and who he is. But love of God, that is what will actually bring you to know God and to being known by God. So Paul acknowledges the facts that the idols amount to nothing, and that there is only one true God. But then he goes on and he makes two assertions. First, he's actually saying, I understand your knowledge, your reasoning, and I agree with it, but you're not exactly right, so don't get too even puffed up. Because then he goes on to say, there are many gods, meaning many powers out there, and there are many lords or masters out there. Now, Paul doesn't reference a verse from the Tanakh to support this, but he easily could have, because we read the following in Deuteronomy 10:17.
For the Lord your God is a God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God who is unbiased and takes no bribe.
And so from this assertion that there are many gods, there are many powers and authorities that are out there, he then goes on to say that though there are many gods and many lords, and I think what he really means here, and we can back that up with what he says a little later on, what is he referring to when he says there's other gods, there's other lords, there's other authorities? He's talking about demons. He's talking about sin. He's talking about death. These are other powers and authorities. And if you're a power, you are a type of not capital G, but low G God. But then he says, but yes, there truly is one who is over all. God is the only true power. Yeshua is the only true master, and he is the creator, and he is the purpose, meaning he is the Alpha and he is the Omega of all. And here Paul appears to be echoing the words of Malachi 2:10.
Do we not all have one Father? Did not one God create us? Why do we betray one another, thus making light of the covenant of our ancestors?
So Paul addresses this issue about knowledge of idols and knowledge of God. But then he goes on to teach why even those with such knowledge should still not eat the food offered to idols. 1 Corinthians 8:7-13 states.
But this knowledge is not shared by all, and some, by being accustomed to idols in former times, eat this food as an idol sacrifice, and their conscience, because it is weak, is defiled. Now food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. But be careful that this liberty of yours does not become a hindrance to the weak. For if someone weak sees you who possesses knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience be strengthened to eat food offered to idols? So by your knowledge the weak brother or sister for whom Messiah died is destroyed. If you sin against your brothers or sisters in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Messiah. For this reason, if food causes my brother or sister to sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I may not cause one of them to sin.
So after Paul assures those that he's writing to that, yes, I understand your argument from knowledge, but he then speaks to those in the about those in the community who do not have such knowledge. And he says, there are people among you who may not share that same knowledge you have. And those are going to be the people coming out of a life filled with pagan practices and rituals who may actually still believe those other powers, those other gods exist. Even though they may have walked away and turned toward, they heard the good news and they responded to it, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden they gave up all of their former beliefs. And therefore, if one of those are eating a sacrifice to Aphrodite, and I only use her as an example because the chief pagan temple in Corinth was a temple to Aphrodite. If one's eating a sacrifice to Aphrodite, they are still communing with that other god, that other power. And it may be a lower power, it may be a lower god, but it's still opposed to the one true God. And therefore, Paul says that those who know better, and I think he's mocking him at that point, because again, he's kind of already proven you actually don't know better. But so I think he mockingly says, to those who know better, you should not exercise your freedom that comes from that knowledge, because it can cause those who are weaker, who are not as mature, who don't have that understanding, to stumble in sin. And it doesn't have to be, Paul, again, we're using the example, Paul's addressing the issue of idols, but it can be anything. Today, when a leader of a religious community is caught lying or cheating, when they're caught in adultery, when they're caught abusing others, and especially if they don't experience consequences because of those sins, it is a signal to the followers, to the sheep of the congregation, that it's actually okay to do those things. Paul then goes so far as to say, if you sin against your brother in this way, if you do something, you have the knowledge, you may have that understanding, but if you do something that causes a weaker brother to stumble, he says it right clearly, you are sinning against the Mashiach. You are sinning against Yeshua if you do that. Okay. So in one sense, we can see the principle of doing no harm as a restriction of our freedoms from this example. But it goes much further than this. Doing no harm, especially no spiritual harm, is important. Because again, Paul's kind of making that argument. Don't cause spiritual harm to others. But the reason behind why we should not do the harm is more important and establishes the greater principle that we are expected to adhere to. If you were paying attention, you should already know what this greater principle is, because Paul already said it right at the beginning. What is greater than knowledge? Love. And that's the greater principle. We are held responsible, and we have to restrict our freedoms, our liberties, to express love towards others. And we'll keep going in Corinthians here to show this. So we move on to chapter 9. 1 Corinthians 9, 1 through 12a continues.
Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Yeshua our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, at least I am to you, for you are the confirming sign of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who examine me. Do we not have the right to financial support? Do we not have the right to the company of a believing wife, like the other apostles and the Lord's brothers in Cephas? Or do only Barnabas and I lack the right not to work? Whoever serves in the army at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its fruit? Who tends a flock and does not consume its milk? Am I saying these things only on the basis of common sense? Or does the law not say this as well? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. God is not concerned here about oxen, is he? Or is he not surely speaking of our benefit? For it was written for us, because the one plowing and threshing ought to work in hope of enjoying the harvest. If we sowed spiritual blessings among you, is it too much to reap material things from you? If others receive this right from you, are we not more deserving?
So having just stated at the end of the previous chapter that he would never eat meat again if it meant saving his brother from stumbling in the faith, Paul, he's anticipating the objections to this. He knows that people are going to object to the limitations he's placing on their freedoms, and as well as on his. They may even say, like, well, Paul, you do have the right to do those things. After all, is he not allowed to have these freedoms due to his knowledge? Or maybe one could even argue, and this is kind of some of the things he's bringing in these examples, my position of authority as an apostle, the apostle to the Gentiles, does that not grant me certain rights that I should be able to partake in? So that's why Paul begins to ask these questions about himself, whether or not he is truly free, whether or not he is an apostle, whether or not he's seen the resurrected Messiah. He asks, why is he different in restricting what he eats and what he drinks? Why is it he's not taking a wife? Why is it he doesn't take pay for his ministry and his administration of the gospel? So Paul asserts here that I do have the freedom and I do have the right to some of these things. I have the ability to eat what I want. That doesn't mean violating kosher. I'm talking about in the context of meat to idols and other things like that. So he asserts that right. He even goes on to say, I could take a wife if I wanted to. I have the right to that. He goes on and says, I even have the right to receive pay for my ministerial work. And he even gives arguments. He argues from common sense. As he said, doesn't the one who planned expect to reap the harvest? You just don't expect to plant and put in the labor and the cost of planting the crop and then not expect to get anything out of it. And then he also uses the example from Torah. You don't muzzle the ox when he treads out the grain. So when the ox is treading the grain, you might muzzle because you don't want him to eat it. But Torah actually forbids that, saying, no, let the ox eat while it's treading out the grain, because that's part of the ox's payment for the work that it's doing. And he even goes so far as to say, look at the other apostles. Look at someone like Peter. He exercises these freedoms and these rights. Peter has a wife. Now, he had a wife, and of course, Peter had a wife before he went in, before Yeshua even called him out. We know that from Mark 1. But the assumption is Peter and some of the other apostles, they actually did take payments. They were probably free will, they were love offerings, free will offerings, and the people would take it, or they would take it to live off of. Paul would reject it, though. So why doesn't Paul exercise these rights? Why doesn't he exercise these freedoms? Well, the answer is given in 12b through 18, which says,
But we have not made use of this right. Instead, we endure everything so that we may not be a hindrance to the gospel of Messiah. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple eat food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar receive a part of the offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded those who proclaim the gospel to receive their living by the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing these things so that something will be done for me. In fact, it would be better for me to die than no one will deprive me of my reasoning for boasting. If I preach the gospel, I have no reason for boasting, because I am compelled to do this. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have reward. But if I do it unwillingly, I am entrusted with a responsibility. What then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights in the gospel.
So first, Paul says he does not exercise his freedom and his rights because he doesn't want to hinder the gospel. Paul asserts, here again, I have the right to receive payment for my preaching of the gospel. And again, he does this first by comparing himself, comparing his ministry to the ministry of the Levitical priests, who received payment for their service in the temple. But then also he says, outright that those who preach the gospel should live from it. Again, so he's giving the argument, yes, it's okay for someone to do it. They have a right to take in, to earn from this ministry. However, he then goes on to say, but I've not used any of these rights because I don't want to be accused by my enemies that I'm preaching this gospel only for my own profit. And if you read the first and especially the second letter of Corinthians, you know he had a lot of enemies in Corinth. But we see this today even. How many times do we see the non-believer, the scoffer, who will look at a minister and say, well, they're only doing that to reap the benefits, to reap the whether it be the income, the status, the position of authority over others, and that's the only reason that they are in ministry. So Paul doesn't want that accusation to ever be leveled against him, and more important, it's not even so much that it'd be leveled against him, but that would be a reason for someone to reject the good news, to reject the message he's bringing forth. So if we think about, in the previous chapter, how Paul said, yeah, I'll forfeit my freedom to eat meat in order to keep the weaker individual from stumbling. So therefore, in that minor thing, I'm going to make sure that I forfeit these other freedoms, these other rights, so that the weaker individual would not reason themselves out of the gospel, or they would have a reason to doubt the gospel, again thinking, well, he's only doing that for his own benefit. And so Paul has established the principle that should guide how we think about exercising our own rights and our own freedoms. Just because we have them does not mean we should always claim them, because we have to put other people first. That should be the first question in our mind when we want to exercise our rights and our freedoms. The first question should be like, do I have the right? It's more, well, how would this, in exercising it, might it impact someone else? And could it have a negative impact on someone else? Could it tear down? Or do I make sure that as I behave, I'm building up? Paul continues in 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23.
For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law towards God, but under law towards Messiah, that I might win those who are without a law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might be all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you.
So making oneself a servant to others, this is what we are all called to do. Now, we may be all called in different ways to serve, but we're all called to serve others. So despite us having freedoms, whether they're the spiritual ones received because of the sacrifice and the resurrection of Yeshua, or if they're just simply political ones that are guaranteed by our Constitution or by natural law, we have to remember the call to serve others and to love one another at all times. We see this elsewhere in the words of Paul in Galatians 5:13 through 14.
For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity to indulge your flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law can be summed up in a single commandment, namely, you must love your neighbor as yourself.
Now, I've been using Paul a lot, but again, Paul isn't just arguing on his own. This isn't just Paul's thoughts. We see Peter makes a very similar argument as well about how to exercise our freedoms. 1 Peter 2:13 through 17 says,
Be subject to every human institution for the Lord's sake, whether to a king as supreme, or to governors as those he commissions, to punish wrongdoers and praise those who do good. For God wants you to silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. Live as free people, not using your freedom as a pretext for evil, but as God's slaves. Honor all people. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the king.
And ultimately, of course, we have the words of Yeshua. He instructed us to serve others. And he demonstrated this the night he was betrayed, the night before he would die on the cross. He demonstrated this to his apostles. John 13:12 through 17 states.
So when Yeshua had washed their feet and put his outer clothing back on, he took his place at the table again and said to them, Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and do so correctly, for that is what I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you too ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example. You should do just as I have done for you. I tell you the solemn truth. The slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who is sent as a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you understand these things, you will be blessed if you do them.
There's so many people out there in the different denominations and congregations who will say with their lips, I want to be like Yeshua. I want to follow in Yeshua's footsteps. I want Yeshua to be my pilot, to take control of my life. But how many of them understand this is what that means? If you want to walk as the shadow of Yeshua, if you want to walk in the image of the Mashiach, this here, serving others first, is what it actually means to do that. And I want to jump ahead to the end of chapter 10 in 1 Corinthians to wrap this up, where we see Paul continuing this idea that just because one has freedom to exercise certain rights, they should not act upon them without first considering the impact they will have on others in terms of both harm. You don't want to cause harm, but even more importantly, you don't want to miss those opportunities to build up or to benefit others. 1 Corinthians 10, 23 through 33 states,
Everything is lawful, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is lawful, but not everything builds others up. Do not seek your own good, but the good of the other person. Eat anything that is sold in the marketplace without questions of conscience. For the earth and its abundance are the Lord's. If an unbeliever invites you to dinner and you want to go, eat whatever is served without asking questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, this is from a sacrifice, do not eat it, because of the one who told you and because of conscience. I do not mean yours, but the other person's. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I blamed for the food that I give thanks for? So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do everything for the glory of God. Do not give offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also try to please everyone in all things. I do not seek my own benefit, but the benefit of many, so that they may be saved.
So in these words, we again see that even though we might have the right to do something, that doesn't mean that we should go ahead and do it. Paul says all things are lawful, meaning that they're permitted or there's a right to do them. Now, he's not saying that all things are allowed within the Torah, and he's not making allowances for those things that are outside of the Torah. But he's saying that all things might be lawful, but they're not profitable. Just because something may be lawful, that doesn't mean that it's profitable, meaning, if you actually look at the Greek word there, meaning they don't bring or bind together, and not all things are edifying, meaning they do not build up. Thus, the ultimate standard of what limits our freedoms is not do no harm, but the ultimate standard is benefit others. Rather than relying on a principle of passivity, don't harm, we are to be guided by a principle of positivity, of action. Go out and serve others. Using this principle, Paul returns to the question originally asked about eating food offered to idols. And his instructions are clear here. If you know that the food you are eating has been offered as part of a pagan sacrifice, you're not to eat it. He says that you don't have to go out of your way to test everything that you eat, but once you learn that, you have to abstain from it. And you have to understand, again, put it in the context of that world. What would happen if you were in Corinth in the first century, and like I said, primary pagan worship there is to Aphrodite. So sacrifices are being made in that temple to this false god all the time. Well, if there was leftover meat from those sacrifices, what would often happen is either that meat would be sent down to the market and then sold in the marketplace, or people would take them home from the temple for celebrations in their own home. So Paul, realizing, and that's why you could easily, if it goes down to the market, someone buys it, you don't know if it was where that meat came from necessarily. So that's why he's saying, don't go out of your way to have to feel like you have to test everything. But again, once that knowledge you have, then you've got to stop, and you cannot eat it. And Paul instructs the believer to abstain from the meat for the sake of the conscience who tells you. It is not for your own conscience, keep in mind. Paul is responding to, it's not for your own conscience. You have to keep in mind Paul is responding to a letter from people who likely had made the contrary argument. or at least reported that this is an argument that's out there about food being offered to idols. But once you learn, and so what he's really saying here, and this is the important part, so once you learn that that food you're eating, or that's now been served to you, is been offered to an idol, again, he's saying it's not for your own conscience that you stop eating it, but it's because now others see you eating it. And that might lead a weaker person astray. It's for the other's consciousness or conscience that you do this. So Paul's concluding principle is that everything we do should ultimately be for the glory of God, and part of that being of what is for the glory of God includes how do we build up, how do we bind together others, especially if it can be a testimony that brings them to salvation. And this, of course, falls right in line with the words spoken by Yeshua when he said the following in Matthew 7:12.
In everything, treat others as you would want them to treat you, for this fulfills the law and the prophets.
So I say what Paul's been teaching through all of this, it falls right in line with what Yeshua says here, known as the Golden Rule. And again, because what Yeshua says when he gives this instruction, again, he's giving an instruction that requires us to act. It requires us to do something positive. It's not simply a passive restriction on what we do. So as we apply this morning's focus on limitations to our freedoms, we see a parallel being between the passive do no harm restriction and the active serve others restriction. Do no harm, again, it's passive. It just means withdrawal. You don't have to do anything. If you do nothing, then you don't sin. But again, Yeshua makes it clear, Paul's making it clear, no, you actually have to do something. And sometimes if you do nothing, that may actually be the sin. You may recall, as has been shared from this bema, that there's a story in the Talmud about a man who went up to Rabbi Hillel and asked him to explain the entire Torah in one sentence. And Hillel responded, very close to the golden rule, sometimes it's called the silver rule, what is hateful to you, do not to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. This answer attributed to Hillel gets very close to the root of Torah, in that he teaches that love of one's neighbor is at the heart of God's instruction. So he gets that part right. However, Hillel's response doesn't quite hit the mark because it comes in this negative passive form. It allows you to simply be passive to your neighbor. It focuses on forbidding what one would not want done to oneself. And it ultimately limits love in the sense of only refraining from what is harmful. I don't want someone to kill me. I'm not going to murder someone else. I don't want someone to steal my property. I don't want someone to try to steal my wife, so I won't do that to others. I don't want someone to vandalize or destroy my property, so I won't do that to others. And such morality is attractive for three reasons. First, again, it only deals with the external self. An individual who follows this axiom laid out by Hillel only needs to worry about his actions, whereas his thoughts and his feelings can be vile and wicked, and he's still okay. As long as you don't murder someone, or even if or as long as you don't physically harm someone, it's fine that in your heart you hate him, according to this rule. You can hold a grudge against them. You can desire bad things to happen to them as long as you're not the one doing it. Second, such an approach to morality requires very little of us. Again, it allows us to be passive to our neighbors because it only focuses on what we shouldn't be doing. Again, simply doing nothing places you in the right. Finally, third, it allows people to live in a world free of judgment as long as, again, they don't interfere with other people. How many times have you heard it as a defense of someone's behavior that if no one's being harmed, what does it matter? Or if this is behavior between two consenting adults, who are you to judge, or who is society to judge? What does it matter to you? In contrast to this, we have the words of Yeshua, which, like I said, consists of a positive action that spurs and directs our actions. It's not a negative one that only restrains or prohibits them. And the difference is monumental in our understanding of God's instructions and in understanding the restrictions that should guide our exercise of freedom. Yeshua does not allow us to take this passive approach to our neighbor. Rather, we have to be active in our lives, acting in ways that demonstrate our love to others. Throughout Yeshua's teachings on the Torah, he emphasizes that it's not enough merely to do what's wrong, but we must actively work in service to him and to others in order to demonstrate concern for their well-being. While it's good not to steal from others, it's even better to give them your coat to those who are in need. While it's good to be honest, it's even greater if we support those who have been falsely accused. It's good to have knowledge and freedom to lift ourselves up, but it's even better to demonstrate love and restrict our freedom so that we build others up. That's what this is all about. And so, just to wrap it all up, to close these things, I want you to listen to the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, 31 through 33.
So whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do everything for the glory of God. Do not give offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. Just as I also try to please everyone in all things, I do not seek my own benefit, but the benefit of many, so that they may be saved.
And that kind of gives you a definition of love. Now, we always go to 1 Corinthians 13 for a definition of love, because Paul is explaining what love is there. But right here, in chapter 10, we have this nice definition of well. We have this great definition of love as well, that you don't seek your own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. It's not our duty to praise the master of all, to ascribe greatness to the author of creation, for he made us unlike the nations of the lands, and has not placed us like the families of the earth. He has not made our portion like theirs, and our lot like all their multitudes. And we bend the knee and bow and acknowledge our thanks before the King over kings, the Holy One, blessed be he. He stretches out heaven and establishes earth's foundation. And the seat of his glory is in the heavens above, and the presence of his power is in the most exalted heights. He is our God, there is none other. True is our King, there is nothing beside him. As it is written in his Torah, and you shall know this day and take to your heart that the Lord, he is God, in the heavens above and on the earth below. There is none other. Amen.
Amen. Let us stand together.